Hello and welcome to another episode of the Play Stamp Here Show. This is the second installment in the US Stamp Basics series. We're going to be talking about 6 degrees of stamp separation. So all separation means is how do you get one or more stamps from a sheet or a pane or a coil or a booklet of stamps. The 6 types of separations we're going to be talking about today is imperforate stamps, perforations, die cut, rouletting, vending machine stamps, and hyphen-hole stamps. Now the last two are a bit of a stretch, but I really wanted to get that 6 degrees of separation reference in there because this is episode 6 of the Play Stamp Here Show. For the most part, all stamps that are perforated are water activated gum stamps, and all the stamps that are die cut are self-adhesive stamps. I can't think of any exception to either one of those, but I'm just going to say for the most part. Now the third type that's used on US stamps very infrequently is rouletting. From what I understand of the postage stamp manufacturing process is that adding perforations or die cuts usually happens towards the end after the design is printed. So you could say that all stamps start out as imperforates. All imperforate means is that it's not perforated, but we use that term for stuff that's not die cut as well. Now technically, being imperforate just means that there is no form of separation. So it's not really a type of separation, kind of like how 0 isn't really a number, it's a placeholder, or how like black isn't really a color, it's the absence of color. But for the most part, most people consider 0 to be a number, and most people consider black to be a color. And for the sake of this episode, imperforate is just a type of separation or lack thereof. Now there's 4 reasons why a stamp is going to be imperforate by the time it gets to the hands of a stamp consumer or a stamp collector. First reason is just that there were no perforated stamps at the time. So like Scott 1 and 2 and 5 through 17, I think, those are imperforate stamps because there was no form of separation. And then the second reason why you would have an imperforate stamp is the post office would sell sheets of imperforate stamps for the purpose of vending machine companies to buy them and perforate them themselves in the use of vending machines. There used to be vending machines all over the place, like in grocery stores and in post offices, where you could put a couple coins in and, pull a lever or push a button and you would get a little packet of stamps. Now, the third reason why there are imperfect stamps in the hands of collectors or consumers is because there was a mistake made somewhere. Here's an example here. These are flag over Supreme Court stamps, and these are not perforated. Somehow along the process, these were fed through a machine and didn't get that means of separation put between the two. The fourth reason that a stamp would be imperforate is to basically get more money from stamp collectors. And what I mean by that is the post office will often release press sheets of imperforate stamps. And I think this has something to do with faults in their die cutting machines, because this has been happening with self-adhesive stamps. And I think they produce some on purpose so that what would be valuable rarities don't get into the hands of the public. And so I think they release a number of these press sheets that are imperforate, and they're usually gobbled up by big companies like Mystic, who then cut them into panes of stamps or individual stamps, and those are sold to collectors. One of the first ones I remember happening was the Bugs Bunny stamp of 1997. Let me find it real quick. Now, when this Bugs Bunny stamp came out, there was 9 stamps on the left, and there'd be 1 stamp on the right, kind of in that big pane with the artwork. And this one's not imperforate. This one has the die cut on there. These Bugs Bunny imperforate sheets, they typically don't sell for less than $100. And I think there's a couple reasons why that is. The first one is this was the lowest number produced commemorative stamp put out by the USPS in the last 87 years. To find the next stamp with the lower production number, you have to go back to that ungummed souvenir sheet from 1935 that I was talking about in my water activated gum versus self-adhesive stamp video. I think they only made like 95,000 of these. But these guys, not this one, but the imperforate, they only made 100 118,000. And it's been 25 years, so my memory's a little fuzzy, but it seems like they didn't tell anybody that they were releasing an imperforate version. Maybe I wasn't reading Lens at the time, but I was collecting stamps, and I did buy this sheet in 1997 from a post office. But as far as I know, I don't think the general public or a lot of stamp collectors knew that this was coming out in an imperforate version. So I'm imagining if these are just released to post offices along with the die cut ones, that a lot of people bought the imperforate not knowing that it was something that was much more uncommon than the regular sheet, and probably used those 9 stamps on the left and then didn't see a way to remove or separate that stamp on the right in that sheet. It just looked like it was just one big pane of artwork, which was what it was, and they probably threw it away because they probably didn't realize that was an actual stamp on there. And compared to the other 4 Looney Tune stamp sets, like that Sylvester and Tweety one I showed you, the following year when they made the imperforate Daffy Duck stamp, in addition to the die cut one, they made like 650,000 of them. Okay, so 118,000 people didn't know it was coming. 650,000 people knew it was coming, and this one had like 500,000. I think the Porky Pig and the Roadrunner one had like 235,000 each. But anyway, that's why you can get this one for $6. But if you had an imperforate one of this, it's going to cost you probably like 120 right now. Okay, so those are the 4 major reasons why you would have an imperforate stamp. It was just before they had perforations, or they made them on purpose for vending machine stamps, or it was some kind of printing error where they didn't perforate the stamps or die cut them. And lastly, as a marketing tool by the USPS to make more money. Going down from imperforate stamps, like I said, there's 3 major ways to produce a form of separation so that you can get those stamps off individually. The first one would be perforations. The second would be die cutting, and the third would be rouletting. Those seem to encompass just about every stamp issue out there by the United States. Predominantly, the form was using perforations. Now, if you look at Scott number 1 and 2, and we're going to skip 3 and 4 because they don't really count. That was like the first generation of postage stamps in the US. Those were imperfect. And then the next generation, and I'm generalizing here, so don't get mad at me if you're a classic collector, but there's 5 more stamps released. This was like the second generation. This was mostly from like 1851 to 56 or something like that. So you had the 1 cent Benjamin Franklin, you had the 3 cent Washington, you had the new and improved 5 cent stamp with Thomas Jefferson on it, and the new and improved 10 cent stamp with George Washington on it. And then you had a 12 cent stamp, which I think also had George Washington on it. So those are the 5 stamps of generation 2. So when the first perforated stamps came out in the United States, they came out in about 1857 through 1861. And they were basically the same designs as those 5 second generation US stamps, but this time they were recut a little bit to make room for those perforations in between the stamps. And those were used until the start of the Civil War. And all perforations mean is they take a bunch of pins and they basically punch a hole through the paper, and that's how you get perforations, because it's perforated. It kind of explains itself. But this was very exciting for stamp consumers and for postal clerks, because it was a lot easier to just kind of fold and tear along the perforations. Now, with a lot of things, they didn't get it right the first time, and the post office experimented a lot with different frequencies of perforations. Now, whenever you see like this is a perf 10, or this is a perf 11, or a perf 8.5, or a 10 by 11, all that means is how many of those perforation holes there are for 2 centimeters. Okay, so if you have a 2 centimeter block of stamp and there's 10 holes in there, then that's perforation 10. Okay, so the higher the number, the more holes there's going to be, and the easier it is to tear them apart. The lower the number, the fewer holes there's going to be, and it's going to take a little bit more effort to separate them. So they tried really high perforation numbers like 15 or 16, but that caused the stamps to separate too easily. And a lot of times the stamps would separate from each other, like in the drawer at the post office. And that created a big problem because stamps are countables, because it's kind of the same as cash for the most part. So instead of counting a sheet of 50 stamps, they would have to pick apart those individual stamps and count them. But if they put too few, like a perforation 6 or 5 even, then you had the same problem with imperforate stamps where they didn't tear as easy and you were ripping part of the stamp next to it along with the stamp that you're trying to separate. There's a lot of experimentation going on with the post office. I think for the most part, about 10 perforations per 2 centimeters was the sweet spot for stamps. But depending on the size of the stamp and the type of paper and some other factors, usually you see the perforations between 8 and 12, with again 10 being that kind of sweet spot for your average stamp. So that's perforations. Die cutting, with the way that self-adhesive stamps are made, you can't necessarily just feed it through a perforation machine because the type of paper is more plasticky and it's not going to rip as easy as those wood fiber paper stamps did. And because of the nature of the adhesive and everything, they found it was easier to do a die cut, which is just basically like if you think of a cookie cutter going down into some dough. That's what die cutting is basically, is you have a wavy design and they're just pressing it into the paper just enough to cut that top layer where the stamp is, not necessarily the backing paper. Because of the nature of self-adhesive stamps, it's really easy just to pick a little corner of that stamp and peel it off versus having to, fold along the perforations like you used to and kind of work your way down so you don't tear like half the next stamp over. So die cut self-adhesive stamps are very popular with stamp consumers. So that's the second type, and that's pretty much the only type of separation you'll see in modern US postage stamps is die cuts. And die cuts can be square, they can be wavy, serpentine cut, they can be whatever they want. But for the most part, they're either straight lines, like on those early self-adhesive stamps that look like they're imperforate, but in reality, they're just die cut with straight lines, or with that serpentine cut that look sort of like perforations that most stamps have. And watch my last stamp basics video, and I talk a lot about self-adhesive versus water-activated gum stamps, and I cover that a little bit. Now, the last major form, and I use major in a bit of a sarcastic way there, of separating stamps in the US is rouletting. Now, there aren't very many rouletted stamps. There's this 29-cent flower or a tulip stamp. There's the red G-rate stamp that looks like an imperforate, but it's actually rouletted. And there's some revenue stamps, and I feel like there's a couple others, and that's about it. But rouletting is different than perforating, where perforations, they remove a piece of the paper so that this is another tulip stamp. This is the F-rate. There's going to be holes in the back. There's chunks of the paper missing from the stamps caused by poking holes through the paper. Whereas rouletting, the paper is scored to the point where you could separate them easily, but there's no missing material in there. It's still all there, the paper. It just makes it easy for them to separate. I don't know why they don't roulette more stamps. I'm assuming it's more expensive, it's less effective, maybe confusing, because, from a foot or two away, these look like imperforate stamps. And maybe because they started doing this in the mid 90s, about the same time as all the self-adhesive started coming out, they kind of gave up on the process. Now, rouletting stamps is usually done with a type of bladed bar or a bladed disc that's kind of run along the paper. And like I said, it doesn't poke holes through the paper, it just cuts it in a way that makes it easier to separate. Now, when it came to the imperforate stamps made for the vending machine companies, and there was companies like Brinkerhoff, Farwell, the International Vending Machine Company, Mailometer, the U.S. Automatic Vending Company, the Attleboro Stamp Company, and the only one that I've had any experience finding copies of is the Shermax, and particularly the Shermac Type 3s. I do have copies of most of the imperforate stamps made for this purpose, and this was done in the US between like 1906 and 1926. You had the 2-cent Washington from the Second Bureau series of 1902. I have like 7 or so different types from the Third Bureau series, which is also known as the Washington Franklins. And I do have some Shermac versions of those. And then there was 4 or 5 with the Fourth Bureau, which is the series in 1922. Now, a lot of these vending machine stamps were pretty cool. Different types of perforations or hyphen-hole perforations or rouletting or whatnot. But the post office kind of put the brakes on it after 20 years and said, you need to conform to the stamps that we put out. We're not going to put out these special imperforate stamps for you, or just use our coil stamps. And that's about it for vending machine. Now, the last type of separation that we're talking about today, there's others that are out there, is called hyphen-hole. These Shermac vending machines, technically these are hyphen-hole perforations because they look kind of like a hyphen. The hyphen is just that dash in between self-adhesive or subtenant on your keyboard. It's, you know, next to the 0 key. That's a hyphen or a dash. Hyphen-hole perforations, they remove a slight piece of the paper like a perforation. So they're kind of more like a rectangular type of perforation. Now besides the vending machine stamps, the only one that I can think of that's put out by the US is some of the 1898 revenue stamps. And some people say revenue stamps aren't stamps, they're Cinderellas. I believe they're stamps. I think there's postage stamps and then there's revenue stamps and a couple other categories, but they're put out by the federal government. I consider them to be stamps. So there's 1898 revenue stamps with the USS Maine on them. And they came in two types. There were proprietary revenue stamps and there were documentary revenue stamps. And revenue stamps is a huge topic and there's just thousands of types of revenue stamps. And both of those, proprietary and documentary, come in two different types. One's rouletted and the other one is in a hyphen-hole stamp. And if you just have singles of these stamps like I do, it's really hard to tell the difference between the two on just singles because of the way that the edges are. But if you have a block of 4 or even 2 of these stamps, it's easy to see the difference because, like I said, rouletting, you're not losing any of the material, the paper, whereas the hyphen-hole perforations, you are. That's cutting out tiny little rectangles of the stamp. So now for the visual learning people out there, I'd like to demonstrate with some Play-Doh and some other household items how I imagine that perforations, die cuts, and rouletting are made. The Play-Doh stuck to the silicone baking sheet a little bit more than I thought it would, and it was a little harder to work with, but it seemed to get the results I wanted. So anyway, here we go. All right, so we're going to take some Play-Doh. Alright, so we're going to pretend this Play-Doh is our stamp paper. And this pick is a perforating machine. So we're just going to see if this works. I'm going to start over a little bit. Put 2 books under this thing. Kind of give it some depth. We're going to have a gap in between the books there. Like this. We're going to try to lay that flat in between. And then we're going to take this pick. This is our perforating machine. We're going to press down in the middle there, drive it through the Play-Doh. Now that's how perforations are made. And if I were to try to tear this apart, see how it just kind of separates like that. And you got the teeth of the perforation tabs or points or peaks or whatever you want to call them along those holes, and there's nothing remaining really of the holes that I made on either side. That's how perforation works. Alright, now we've reset the Play-Doh, and I'm going to show you how die cutting works using a pumpkin cookie cutter. Die cut is basically just some sharp blades to come down onto the die cut or onto the stamp paper like that. Or we could try a bottle cap. Maybe this is a better example because it looks more like perforations. This Play-Doh is a little thicker than it should be, but when you peel the stamp off, in theory you would get a pumpkin shaped stamp, and under here you would have a bottle cap shaped stamp, and you can even has like little die cut fake perforations on there. And this would have made a much better forever stamp than that one we got with the pumpkins on it, although I like that one. Stamp tongs, 1001 uses. But that's die cutting. That's how you would separate a stamp using die cuts. All right, so we've reset this again. We're going to try to recreate what rouletting is. This thing is a wallpaper stripper. Basically, it has these two little wheels on there, and you kind of just randomly go over the wallpaper like this, and then you use like a paint roller, and you get a bunch of, it's kind of like removing a self-adhesive stamp. You apply a bunch of chemicals, and then you basically strip the whole thing off with a flat edge. But that's too random for what I'm trying to do. So we're going to pop this guy off. I'm going to try and make a straight line here to kind of show you what rouletting looks like. Now, I pressed down pretty hard, so I might have made this more like perforations. But this is basically what rouletting is. And in theory, this should peel off the paper if I can get it purchased on this. See, it's separating the paper there pretty good. In this case, it's Play-Doh. But I'm pulling that strip up of the rouletted stuff. So that's basically what rouletting is this just kind of scores the, I mean, I'm pressing down pretty hard, but this should score it enough where you can just peel it away without actually like removing pieces like the perforations did. But anyway, that's how die cuts, perforations, and rouletting are basically made. So I think that's about it for this episode. Hope you learned something. We just talked about different types of separations for stamps. And remember, either they're imperforate and they don't have a means of separation, or they're die cut, or they're perforated. And in rare cases, they're rouletted. I hope you enjoyed this video. The next US Stamp Basics episode we would probably do on the difference between pane stamps, booklet stamps, and coil stamps. But I'm hoping to do a few more episodes in between there on the self-adhesive stamps in 1997 and 1998. Thanks for watching. You can find me on Twitter at PlayStampHere, or you could write me. My P.O. Box number is The Play Stamp Here Show, P.O. Box 921, Twin Falls, Idaho, 83303-0921. Thanks for watching.